The soft morning light filled the hospital room, casting a gentle glow on the three women who sat vigil by the bed. The man lying there, once strong and muscular, now looked frail and worn. His body was ravaged by cancer. A petite brunette in her late 40s, Sarah, cradled his hand against her cheek. Her curly, shoulder-length hair partially hid her tear-streaked face. Seated beside her was a younger version of the woman, likely in her late 20s. On the opposite side of the bed stood a tall, attractive blonde around 30 years old who bore a striking resemblance to the man. With great tenderness, she wiped her father's bald head. The quiet watch was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. A tall, blonde man, Michael, poked his head in and whispered to the blonde sister, "Is he awake?" "Not right now, Eric," Sarah replied quietly. "He only wakes up for brief moments. The morphine keeps him mostly asleep." Michael turned to the older brunette. "Holly," he said softly, "can we come in?" She looked up at him with a weak smile and nodded. He stepped back, holding the door open as a woman in her early 50s entered the room hesitantly. Her long hair, streaked with blonde and silver, hung loosely around her shoulders. Despite her age, her figure was still one to be envied by women much younger. "Holly," she greeted softly. "Naomi, come in," Michael said, standing up and exchanging a glance with Sarah. Sarah gave a reassuring nod. "You can sit here, Mom," Michael said. "Thanks, Michael," Naomi replied. What followed was a subtle, silent dance, a human chess game. Every movement toward the bed caused another to shift in response, as if all were carefully navigating their emotional positions. Finally, the room settled. Naomi took a seat on the opposite side of the bed from Sarah and her daughter, Emma. Michael moved to one corner of the room, while Eric sat in the other. "Thank you for letting me come," Naomi said softly. "When the kids told me David was spending whatever time he had left at home, I knew I had to see him. It was the right thing to do." "David agreed," Sarah answered tiredly. "He didn't want any visitors once he's back home later today. So I'm glad you were able to make it before he's discharged." A soft groan escaped the man in the bed as his eyes fluttered open. Eyes that had not met in over a decade now locked onto one another. "Naomi," he rasped weakly. "I'm here, Dean," she whispered. "Where's Sarah?" "I'm right here, honey," his wife replied gently, patting his hand. He smiled faintly, his gaze softening as he looked into her eyes. Slowly, he glanced around the room, noting everyone's presence. "We are gathered here today," he said, his voice barely audible though it sparked a few quiet chuckles around the room. He sighed deeply, then cleared his throat and shifted his gaze to Naomi. "All right, Naomi," he said in a strained voice. "Say what you need to say. I might drift off, though. I can't seem to stay awake." "I understand, Dean," Naomi said softly. "I'll be brief. And don't worry if you fall asleep. Most of what I need to say is for the kids anyway." He gave a small nod, and she took a deep breath. "Dean, I just wanted to say goodbye." "We already did that 10 years ago," he replied. "Yes," she acknowledged, her voice trembling slightly. "But when I heard you were dying, I realized I still had things I needed to say." "I need your forgiveness," she said, her voice now barely a whisper. "Please, Dean, tell me you forgive me." For a moment, they stared at each other in silence before Dean let out a soft sigh. "You're forgiven," he said, his voice hoarse. Naomi sat back, clearly taken aback by the simplicity of his response. "Just like that?" she asked in disbelief. He let out a small, dry laugh. "No, not just like that. It took years for me to be able to say that and mean it. Sarah was a big part of it." He winced in pain, letting out a stifled groan before pressing the button for his morphine drip. Within moments, his breathing slowed and his face relaxed. Minutes later, he drifted back to sleep. "I'm sorry, Naomi," Sarah said gently. "He'll be out for a while now. I know it wasn't exactly what you hoped for." Naomi shook her head, her voice full of quiet gratitude. "Actually, it's more than I ever dreamed of. Hearing him say he forgave me, it's all I needed." "You've got me to thank for that," Sarah said, smiling softly. "No, Sarah," Naomi said. "You couldn't make David do anything he didn't truly want to do." Jessica, standing nearby, snapped bitterly, You didn't lose his love, Mother. You threw it away. Naomi's expression turned sad. I know, Jessica, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. We all have regrets, Kelsey muttered, her tone sharp as she crossed her arms. Naomi took a deep breath, her eyes glancing between her children. We all do things we wish we hadn't. But my biggest regret? Losing control back then. I can't excuse it. Jessica cut in coldly. Don't even try. I'm not excusing anything, Naomi responded. I was messed up. There were things going on that neither you nor Michael knew about. Your father and I never gave you the full picture. I didn't because I feared you'd hate me more than you already do. Jessica's eyes were hard as she said, I don't hate you, Mother, but I hate what you did to Dad, Michael, and me. Naomi's voice cracked as she replied, I'm sorry for the pain I caused. How could you not know it would destroy him? Michael asked calmly, his disappointment clear. I knew, Naomi admitted, but I was selfish. By the time I realized how far I had gone, it was too late. Jessica and Michael stayed silent, their faces unreadable. Naomi continued, her voice heavy with regret. During the divorce, people kept asking me why. I had no good answer then, but now, I know I was driven by my own insecurities and fears. I didn't stop loving your father, not even during the affair. Jessica sneered. How can you say that when you were with another man? I know it sounds impossible, Naomi said, but it's true. The problem wasn't that I didn't love him. It was that I loved myself more. I let my unhappiness justify betraying our marriage. Naomi sighed deeply before continuing. When I ended things, it was too late. The damage was done. I tried to hide it, to protect him from the truth, but I knew he'd divorce me if he ever found out. Michael's voice softened. Why tell him then? Was it just to ease your guilt? No, Michael. Naomi shook her head. It wasn't me who forced the confession. It was fate. She paused, gathering herself before continuing. When I ended things with Colin, I made it clear that he was never to work with your father. But Colin didn't care. When a big contract came up, David ended up working under him. Her voice trembled as she recalled the events. I confronted Colin, but he refused to step aside. I knew the secret would come out eventually, so I told your father. He handled it calmly, but when I saw the tear roll down his cheek, I knew it was over. Naomi wiped her eyes as she continued. David withdrew from the project, and all hell broke loose. His company thrived while Colin and I were blacklisted. Michael's voice was cold. And what about you? Colin and I lost everything. But your father? He moved on. And I'm glad he did. Naomi's voice softened as she continued her confession. Colin and I didn't fare nearly as well after everything came out. We were effectively blacklisted. Colin's father-in-law, furious at the scandal, used his influence to ruin both of our careers. Colin got sent to all the terrible projects in third-world countries for years. Eventually, he gave up, divorced his wife, and the last I heard, he's selling insurance in Detroit. She paused, looking at her children. As for me, I got a promotion, but it was more to avoid a lawsuit than anything else. They shoved me into a position where I barely saw the light of day. The money's decent, but my career is over. There's no future for me at the company. Jessica's face remained tight with frustration, and Michael's disappointment was clear. It hurt Naomi to see their reactions, but she pressed on. If I thought work was bad, home was even worse. My marriage was disintegrating, and I had no power to save it. Your father tried to talk to me a few times after the divorce papers were filed. I apologized over and over, telling him it was all my fault. But he looked at me and said, if our marriage was so wonderful, why wasn't it enough to keep you out of Colin's bed? The room was silent. Naomi wiped away a tear. I understood why he was angry, but it still stung. He asked me why I did it, and I could only give him weak excuses. After that, he stopped talking to me completely. I was furious at myself for causing this mess and furious at him for not trying to save what we had. Oh, please, Mother, Jessica interrupted sharply. If Dad had cheated on you, would you have forgiven him and fought for the marriage? Naomi shook her head slowly. No, sweetheart. I know I wouldn't have. I would have been even more vindictive than your father ever was. But your father, he chose to walk away quietly. He had every right to make my life miserable, but he didn't. Michael, calm but firm, chimed in. I never blamed Dad for the way he reacted. I was just angry to see our family fall apart, and knowing there was nothing I could do to stop it. Naomi nodded, her voice thick with emotion. You're right. If your father really wanted to make my life unbearable, he could have taken me back. But he didn't. He let me go, and I'll always carry the weight of that. Eric, who had been quietly listening, asked gently, What did you mean by that, Mom? Naomi sighed deeply. I would have done anything to make amends with your father. I would have degraded myself just to have a chance at winning back his love. But when I confessed, I saw the moment his love for me died. I knew I had lost him forever. Her eyes filled with regret. I prayed for over a year that somehow I could get my marriage back. I begged God to change David's heart and give me another chance. But when I heard he had started dating Sarah, I knew my prayers wouldn't be answered. She looked at Sarah with a mixture of sadness and acceptance. I started dating again, hoping to move on, but it was never the same. I compared every man to David, and no one measured up. Even when I was proposed to twice, I turned them both down. Sarah, soft with empathy, asked, Why? Naomi let out a long sigh. Because I was still in love with David, and I realized that if I couldn't stay faithful to him, how could I promise to be faithful to anyone else? It wouldn't have been fair to them. Sarah's face softened. I'm sorry you're going through that, Naomi. Naomi smiled sadly. Thank you, Sarah. But please don't think I'm making excuses. I know I caused my own pain, and I have to live with that every day. Melissa smirked, leaning in. Come on, Kelsey. You know what I'm talking about. I mean hitting it. Making babies. Kelsey burst out laughing, while Holly blushed a deep red. Girls, she scolded playfully. Eric chuckled along. But Naomi stayed quiet, her expression tense. Sarah cleared her throat, trying to steer the conversation back. What I was trying to say was before David and I got together, there was this tension between us, but we hadn't crossed that line. Then I overheard him talking on the phone. I thought it was with you, Jessica, but maybe I was wrong. He mentioned something about reconciling with Naomi. Naomi froze but said nothing. I love David, Sarah continued, her voice quieter now. But after what happened with my first marriage, I was scared. My ex had abandoned us, and I hadn't let anyone get close to me since then. David was the first person I really opened up to, and I was terrified of losing him. She paused, looking around at her kids. So, I made a decision, one I'm not proud of. That week, I threw myself at him. I seduced him. Melissa grinned. Oh please, Mom. Dad probably didn't need much convincing. You two were always all over each other. Kelsey laughed. Yeah, we'd catch you guys making out like teenagers. Holly flushed even more, but Melissa just shrugged. Seriously though, Mom, I don't see why you're so hung up on that. You wanted him. No harm in showing it. Sarah's smile faded slightly. It's not that, Melissa. I don't regret showing your father how much I wanted him, but I do regret the reason behind it. I acted out of fear. I was so scared he might go back to Naomi. The room grew quiet for a moment. Holly finally nodded. You know, your father always says I saved him. But the truth is, he saved me. After my ex, I couldn't trust anyone. Then David came along and he changed everything. Melissa smirked again. Okay, we get it. You saved each other. But let's not pretend Dad didn't enjoy every bit of it. Holly gasped. Melissa. Her face had turned bright red, but the laughter in the room was infectious. Eric, shaking his head, added, Dad always said you and Melissa were what kept him going. He'd say you two saved him. Holly smiled softly, the playful banter shifting to something more sentimental. These last 8 years, your father's illness was hard, but he still made them the happiest of my life. Finally, Naomi broke her silence, her voice shaky. I didn't know David was considering coming back to me. Who would he have told? Kelsey hesitated. It was me. He told me. He was torn. There was still love, but there was so much hurt too. Her voice softened. I stayed with Dad that summer, right after the affair came out. I found him crying more times than I can count. Naomi's eyes filled with tears. I didn't realize. He didn't want you to know, Kelsey said quietly. But in the end, I pushed him toward Holly. Not because I hated you, but because I couldn't watch him try to fix something that was too broken. Melissa grinned mischievously. Kelsey and I were actually plotting to get Mom and Holly together. We set them up, basically. We figured, if they were in the same place, sparks would fly. And they did, Holly added, smiling despite the embarrassment. Melissa winked. You can thank us later. Eric interjected, his tone understanding. I knew something was off. I cared more for you than you did for me. But that first visit to my house really threw me. After seeing the way you and Dad interacted, I was even more confused. Melissa laughed lightly, attempting to break the tension. Let's just say it's a bit rough on a guy's ego when his girlfriend falls harder for his dad than for him. She paused, her expression shifting as she recalled that visit. But after your next visit with your mom, I finally got it. Until then, I was worried I'd fallen for someone with serious daddy issues. A shared chuckle filled the room, bringing a sense of relief. I guess in a way, I did, Melissa continued, her tone lightening. Not many 19-year-olds change their last name when their mom remarries, especially when we didn't even live under the same roof. But Dean, well, Dad has been more of a father to me than anyone else ever was. Eric smiled, glancing between Melissa and Sarah. Yeah, well, after seeing you and Mom, and watching how my dad reacted to both of you, it was obvious. I couldn't remember the last time I'd seen him smile like that. The atmosphere was filled with bittersweet smiles, shared memories evoking both happiness and regret. But after a moment of silence, Eric shifted the tone. Well, he said, his voice quieter, since everyone's sharing their confessions, I guess it's my turn. All eyes turned toward Eric, curiosity piqued. He cleared his throat dramatically. I just wanted to let you all know that next week, you'll probably see something in the papers that might shock you. And yes, it's true. I'm the lost Kardashian sister, and I'm engaged to Bruce, Caitlyn Marie Jenner. Kelsey snorted, and the room burst into laughter, providing a welcome relief from the heavy emotions that had settled earlier. Just like his father, Naomi and Sarah said simultaneously, catching each other by surprise. Eric beamed. Thanks, I can't think of a better compliment. The laughter faded, and the room's mood shifted back to somberness. Naomi stood gracefully and offered a small, sad smile. Sarah, she began, her voice soft and sincere, thank you again for allowing me to come today. I'm still trying to move forward, and this meeting was a big step. Thank you for making it possible. Sarah nodded warmly. You're welcome, Naomi. I hope this brings you some peace and helps you move on. David made the final decision, and we both thought something good could come from this. If he hadn't agreed, I wouldn't have either. I'll always protect him from being hurt. Naomi's voice trembled as she whispered, I wish I'd been that fiercely loyal. Turning to her son, she asked, Can you drive me back to my hotel? Eric nodded and began gathering his things. Naomi cast a long, lingering look at David's frail form still sleeping in the bed. Holly, Naomi said quietly, please tell David he's in my prayers. You and Melissa are too. I will, Naomi, Holly replied sincerely as Naomi and Eric left the room. The quietness that followed was heavy with unresolved emotions, yet there was a subtle sense of closure in the air. As Naomi slowly exited, her steps felt burdened by the weight of finality. Once the door closed behind her, the emotions she had been holding back overwhelmed her. Tears streamed down her face as quiet sobs escaped her. She knew this was the last time she would ever see the love of her life alive. 2.5 weeks later, David Michael Johnson, at the age of 53, passed away peacefully in his sleep at home, surrounded by his loving family. The graveside service was bittersweet, a blend of grief and celebration of a life well lived. Sarah sat between Melissa and Jessica in the front row, her face etched with sorrow yet radiating quiet strength. To the surprise of some in attendance, Naomi sat in the front row as well, positioned between Jessica and Michael. After the service, friends and family offered their condolences before heading to the family reception, leaving the immediate family to their private mourning. Outside, by the limousine, all three of David's adult children stood around Sarah. Sarah, Jessica began gently, her voice full of gratitude. Thank you. I never thought I'd see Dad smile again after the divorce, but you and Mel brought joy back into his life. You reminded him he could love again. There was no doubt he loved you both so deeply. Holly reached over and took Jessica's hand tenderly. Never forget how much he loved you and Michael. He was always so proud of the two of you. We know, Eric said, a sad smile on his face. But divorces are hard. As they stood together, enveloped by the bittersweet memories, a sense of unity filled the air, reminding them of the love they shared for their father and each other. The graveside service was bittersweet. Sarah sat between Melissa and Jessica in the front row, her face etched with grief yet filled with quiet strength. To everyone's surprise, Naomi sat there too, between Jessica and Michael. After the service, friends and family offered their condolences before heading to the family reception, leaving the immediate family to mourn privately. Outside, by the limousine, David's 3 adult children stood around Sarah. Sarah, Jessica began gently, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you. I never thought I'd see Dad smile again after the divorce, but you and Mel brought joy back into his life. You reminded him he could love again. There was no doubt he loved you both deeply, Holly added, reaching for Jessica's hand. He was always so proud of you and Michael. We know, Eric replied with a sad smile. But divorces are hard. Holly nodded. They are. But through it all, David never stopped loving you. He loved you both deeply. I know, Jessica said, her voice trembling. I just wish we could have given him more. More time. More happiness. We all do, Sarah said, her eyes filling with tears. But we did the best we could. We gave him our love and support, and for that, I'm grateful. I'm grateful too, Michael added, his voice choked with emotion. I'm so glad he had you, Sarah. You made the last few years of his life so much better. Emma smiled through her tears. I'm glad I could make him happy. I loved him so much. I know you did, Sarah said, pulling her daughter into a warm embrace. After a moment, Sarah turned to Naomi. Thank you for coming today, Naomi. It meant a lot to David to see you. Naomi nodded, tears in her eyes. I'm glad I did. I needed to say goodbye. She turned to Eric. Thank you for driving me here. You're welcome, Mom, he replied. As they watched Naomi drive away, the 3 siblings stood in silence, their hearts heavy with grief. She's changed, Jessica said softly. She has, Sarah agreed. I think she's finally found peace. I hope so, Michael replied. Linking arms, the 3 siblings looked out at the cemetery where David would soon be laid to rest. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the graves, they knew that while their father was gone, his memory would live on in their hearts forever.